Serious problems threatened the economic prosperity of the nation in the late 1920s. The superficial prosperity of the late 20s masked weaknesses that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. Key basic industries such as railroads, textiles, and steel were barely making a profit. Mining and lumbering, which had expanded during wartime, were no longer in high demand. Coal mining was especially hard hit as a result of the competition from new forms of energy such as hydroelectric power, fuel oil, and natural gas. One important economic indicator that declined was housing starts, the number of new homes being built. When housing starts to fall, so do related industries such as furniture manufacturing and lumber. Perhaps agriculture suffered the most. During World War I, prices rose and international demand for crops soared. Farmers planted more and took out loans for land and equipment. However, demand fell after the war and crop prices declined by as much as 40% or more. Farmers boosted production in hopes of selling more crops, but this only depressed prices further. Many farmers went into debt and lost their farms to foreclosure. As farmers defaulted on their loans, many rural banks also began to fail. President Calvin Coolidge refused to take action, saying that farmers had never made money, so he felt that there was little the government could do to alleviate the situation. As farmers' incomes fell, they bought fewer goods and services, but the problem was larger. Americans in general were buying less, mainly because of rising prices, stagnant wages, unbalanced distribution of income, and overbuying on credit. While many Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 20s, they were in fact living beyond their means through credit. By making credit easily available, businesses encouraged Americans to pile up a large consumer debt. Many people then had trouble paying off their growing debts. During the 20s, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Unequal distribution of income meant that most Americans could not participate fully in the economic advantages of the 1920s. Most people did not have the income to buy the flood of products being turned out by American industry. While economic disaster lay around the corner, the election of 1928 took place in a mood of apparent national prosperity. The election pitted Republican Herbert Hoover against Democrat Alfred E. Smith. Hoover had served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge. Hoover's strength lay in years of prosperity under the past two Republican presidents. In his campaign, Hoover proclaimed America to be nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. It was an overwhelming victory for Hoover. Americans appeared happy with Republican leadership. By 1929, some economists were warning of weaknesses in the economy, but most Americans, ignored the warnings. The stock market had become the most visible symbol of a prosperous American economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was the most widely used barometer of the stock market's health. The Dow is measured based on the stock prices of 30 representative firms trading on the New York Stock Exchange. Through most of the 20s, stock prices rose steadily. Eager to take advantage of this bull market, or period of rising stock prices, Americans rushed to buy stocks. In doing so, many Americans were engaging in speculation, or buying stocks on the chance of a quick profit while ignoring the risks. Many began buying on margin, paying a small percentage of the stock's price as a down payment and borrowing the rest. Unrestrained buying and selling fueled the market's upward spiral, and the government did nothing to regulate that market. In reality, the rising prices did not truly reflect companies' worth. Worse, if the value of stocks declined, people who bought on margin had no way to pay off the loans. In early September 1929, stock prices peaked and then fell. Confidence in the market began to waver. Some investors quickly sold their stocks and pulled out. Thursday, October 24, 1929, became known as Black Thursday. The stock market took a plunge as panicking investors unloaded their stocks. And then the following Tuesday, October 29th, became known as Black Tuesday. The bottom fell out of the market and the nation's confidence. Shareholders frantically tried to sell before their prices plunged lower. The number of shares dumped that day was a record 16.4 million. People who had bought stocks on credit were stuck with huge debts as the prices plummeted. Others lost most of their life savings. By mid-November, investors had lost over $30 billion, the same amount America had spent fighting World War I. After the stock market crashed, many people panicked and tried to withdraw their money from banks. But many could not get their money from the banks because banks had also invested in the stock market. 600 banks closed in 1929. By 1933, 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks had failed. Because the government did not protect or insure bank accounts, millions of people lost their life savings. Other businesses were hit as well. The nation's GNP, or total output of goods and services, was cut in half between 1929 and 1932. Approximately 90,000 businesses went bankrupt, including once prosperous automobile and railroad companies. As the economy plunged into a tailspin, many workers lost their jobs. Unemployment leapt from 3%, 1.6 million workers, in 1929 to 25%, or 13 million workers, in 1933. The United States was not the only country gripped by the Great Depression. Much of Europe had suffered throughout the 20s as they tried to recover from the ravages and high war debts of World War I. The Depression compounded these problems by limiting America's ability to import European goods, which in turn made it difficult to sell American farm products and manufactured goods abroad. Then in 1930, Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which established the highest protective tariff in U.S. history. It was designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition, but it actually had the opposite effect. By reducing the flow of goods into the U.S., the tariff prevented other countries from earning currency used to buy American goods. Many countries even retaliated with their own tariffs, and soon world trade fell off by more than 40%. So to review the causes of the Great Depression: uneven distribution of income. Wages had risen very little compared to increases in productivity and corporate profits. The top 5% of the richest Americans accounted for 33% of all income. Stock market speculation. Many believed they could get rich by playing the market. Speculation and buying on margin falsely inflated the price of stocks and caused many to lose everything they had when the market collapsed. While the collapse of the market may have triggered the Great Depression, it was not alone responsible for it. Excessive use of easy credit. A belief by both consumers and businesses that the economic boom of the 20s was permanent led to increased buying on credit. When the economy collapsed, people could not repay loans and banks and businesses began to fail. Overproduction of consumer goods. Business growth combined with increased productivity and easy credit created a volume of goods that consumers with stagnant wages could not continue to buy. Weak farm economy. Prosperity of the 20s never reached farmers, who suffered from overproduction, high debt, and low prices since the end of World War I. During the 30s, severe weather and a long drought added to farmers' difficulties. Government policies also contributed to the Depression. During the 20s, the government had complete faith in business and did little to control or regulate it. Congress enacted high tariffs which protected U.S. industries but hurt farmers and international trade. And finally, global economic problems. Europe had never recovered from World War I, and the U.S. failed to recognize Europe's problems due to America's desire to return to isolationism after the war. The U.S. insisted that wartime loans be repaid in full, but at the same time enacted tariffs that greatly reduced the sale of European goods in America. Europe's difficulties contributed to the Depression in the U.S., which would now turn into a worldwide depression. In cities across the country, people lost their jobs. They were evicted from their homes and ended up in the streets. Many slept in parks or sewer pipes, wrapping themselves in newspapers in an attempt to stay warm. Others built makeshift shacks out of scrap metals, and before long, numerous shanty towns sprang up. Many people began calling these shanty towns Hoovervilles out of disgust for President Hoover. Every day, the poor dug through garbage cans or begged for food. Soup kitchens offering low-cost or free food, and bread lines where people waited to receive handouts from charitable organizations became a common sight. Conditions for African Americans and Latinos were especially difficult. Their unemployment rates were higher, and they were the lowest paid among those who could find work. They also dealt with increasing racial violence from unemployed whites competing for the same jobs. 24 African Americans died by lynching in 1933 alone. Life in rural areas was even harder, but it did have one advantage over city life. Most farmers, at least, could grow food for their families. With falling prices and rising debt, thousands of farmers lost their land. Between 1929 and 1932, about 400,000 farms were lost to foreclosure. Then, in the early 1930s, a drought began that wreaked havoc on the Great Plains. During the previous decade, farmers used new and improved tractors to break up large sections of prairie grassland. Plowing removed this protective layer of prairie grasses. Farmers also exhausted the land through overproduction of crops, and the grasslands became unsuitable for farming. When drought and high winds began in the early 1930s, little grass and few trees were left to hold the soil down. Wind scattered topsoil, exposing sandy grit beneath. The dust resulting traveled hundreds of miles. The area hardest hit, including parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, became known as the Dust Bowl. Plagued by dust storms and evictions, thousands of farmers and sharecroppers packed up their families and moved west along Route 66 to California. These migrants came to be known as Okies. In the face of the suffering caused by the Depression, the family stood as a source of strength for most Americans. Some feared hard times would undermine moral values, but those fears were largely unfounded. In general, Americans believed in traditional values and emphasized the importance of family unity. Many families entertained themselves by playing Monopoly, which was invented in 1933, and listening to the radio. The Depression put severe pressure on families. Making ends meet was a daily struggle, and some families indeed broke apart under the strain. Many men had difficulty coping with unemployment because they were accustomed to working and supporting their families. They would walk the streets each day in search of work. Some seemed to weather the suffering well enough for the first weeks or even months, but as the Depression stretched into years, the hardships began to take their toll. Some men became so discouraged that they simply stopped trying, and some even abandoned their families. As many as 300,000 transients, or hobos, wandered the country, hitching rides on railroad boxcars and sleeping under bridges. During the early years of the Depression, there was no system of direct relief or cash payments for food provided by the government to the poor. Some cities and charities did offer relief to those who needed it, but these efforts were meager. The most generous relief offered by any city was $2.39 per family in New York City, but this was still too little to feed a family for a week. Women worked hard to help their families survive adversity during the Depression. Women who worked outside the home became the targets of enormous resentment during the Depression. Many believed that women, especially married women, had no right to work when there were men who were unemployed. It has been assumed that women did not suffer as much as men because women were rarely seen in the breadlines. But the women were generally starving and freezing at home while trying to ease the suffering of their children. Children with poor diets and lack of health care had many serious health problems during the Depression. Clinics and hospitals reported an alarming rise in malnutrition and diet-related diseases. Falling tax revenues caused school boards to shorten the school year or even close schools altogether. 2,600 schools had been forced to close by 1933, leaving more than 300,000 students out of school. Thousands of children went to work in sweatshops instead, in an effort to help support their families. The hardships of the Great Depression had a tremendous social and psychological impact. Some were so demoralized by hard times that they lost their will to survive. Between 1929 and 1932, the suicide rate rose more than 30%. 3 times as many people were admitted to state mental hospitals as in normal times. Economic problems forced many Americans to accept compromises and make sacrifices that affected them for the rest of their lives. Adults stopped going to the doctor and dentist. Young people gave up their dream of going to college in order to work to support their families. For many, the stigma of poverty and having to scrimp and save never disappeared completely. Achieving financial security became the primary focus in life. As a result of the Depression, more people developed habits of saving and thriftiness. After the stock market crash of 1929, Hoover tried to reassure the nation that the economy was stable. He declared, "Any lack of confidence in the economic future is foolish." He felt the most important thing was for Americans to remain confident and go about their business as usual. Many experts believed the best course of action was to do nothing and let the economy fix itself. Americans also valued rugged individualism, the idea that people should succeed through their own efforts rather than depend on the government to take care of them and their families. However, the Depression proved more than families could stand, and people were shocked and frustrated by Hoover's lack of action. Hoover's political philosophy caused him to take cautious steps against the Depression. Soon after the stock market crash, he called together key leaders of business and industry and urged them to work together to find solutions. He asked employers not to cut off wages or lay off workers, and he asked labor leaders not to strike or demand higher wages. None of these steps made much difference. 1 year after the crash, the economy was still shrinking and unemployment was still rising. One project that Hoover did approve that did make a difference was he authorized the construction of Boulder Dam on the Colorado River Basin, now known as Hoover Dam. The massive project was the world's tallest dam. In addition to providing electricity and flood control, the dam also provided a regular water supply, which enabled the growth of California's massive agricultural economy. Today, the dam also provides water for both Las Vegas and Los Angeles. As the Depression deepened, Hoover gradually softened his position on government intervention. He tried to prop up the banking system by persuading the nation's larger banks to establish the National Credit Corporation, which loaned money to smaller banks to prevent them from closing. He also established the Federal Farm Board to try to raise farm prices. By 1931, it was obvious these measures would not be enough, and with the election of 1932 looming, Hoover urged Congress to reform banking. In 1932, Hoover signed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act into law. It was designed to lower mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans to avoid foreclosure. Hoover's most ambitious economic measure was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC. It authorized up to $2 billion for emergency financing for banks, railroads, and other large businesses. Hoover believed that this money would eventually trickle down to provide jobs and higher wages. Many questioned this approach, saying that the poor needed direct relief. Hungry people could not wait for the trickle-down effect to begin. The RFC loaned $805 million in its first 5 months, but business failures continued. It was too little, too late. In the spring of 1932, between 10,000 and 20,000 World War I veterans and their families arrived in Washington, D.C. to support a bill being considered by Congress to provide additional bonuses to World War I vets. These people were known as the Bonus Army. This bonus, approved by Congress in 1924, was supposed to be paid out in 1945. in the form of cash and a life insurance policy. But Congressman Wright Patman believed that the bonus, an average of $500 per soldier, should be paid out immediately. On June 17th, the Senate voted down the Patman bill. Hoover then called on the bonus army to disband and leave the Capitol. Approximately 2,000 of these refused to budge, still hoping to convince the president to take action. Nervous that the group would become violent and riot, Hoover called out the army on July 28th. 1,000 soldiers, commanded by Douglas MacArthur and Dwight D. Eisenhower, rousted the veterans from their shanty towns erected in Washington, D.C. In the course of the operation, the Army gassed more than 1,000 people, including an 11-month-old baby who died and an 8-year-old boy who was blinded. Americans were outraged, and Hoover's image suffered.